very much. I'm not wearing a watch, so just when I cross 10-12 minutes, let me know, because I do want to take some questions and answer whatever questions you have in mind. The topic given to me is to make a case for, or to ask whether there is a case for not-for-profit journalism. And like everything else that we've been discussing at Talk Journalism, there is a context to this question being asked. And the context has to do with the general perception that journalism in India today is in some kind of crisis. There is a crisis of credibility. There is a crisis of sustainability. Serious questions are being asked about whether the media in India is willing and able to write and broadcast honestly about what is happening in the country. In the last 24 hours, we have before us the example of 2 newspapers and a magazine putting out a story based on the election affidavits of Mr. Amit Shah, where they compared the assets declared for his Rajya Sabha nomination for 2017 with the affidavit he filed for the Gujarat Vidhan Sabha election of 2012, and they noted how there had been a huge jump in the assets of Mr. Amit Shah and his wife by 300%. Since those affidavits have still not been uploaded on the Election Commission website, we are not in a position to judge the accuracy of these original stories. But the fact is that 2 newspapers with correspondents and bureaus in Ahmedabad, DNA and Times of India, both reported this story, both had the same numbers. And within a few hours of the stories were published in the paper in the morning, but within a few hours, on the basis of some kind of external pressure, these stories vanished from the websites of these 2 newspapers. Now, I'm still hoping, I tweeted today, because we wrote about this in The Wire, I'm still hoping that there is a more innocent explanation for why this has happened. Because otherwise, this is an alarming sign of what many of us in the media have suspected for a long time. Many of you readers, many of you journalism students have perhaps harbored these fears that the media in India is fast losing its appetite to confront or to report honestly, and is coming under pressure from people in authority, people in power, to ignore certain stories, report certain stories in a slanted way, and if when you do a story that the government or people in authority don't like, then you have it removed. Now, what does this have to do with whether journalism is there for profit or not for profit? Well, at one level, it doesn't have all that much. India and the United States both have mass media which is largely driven by private interest. Other than Voice of America, which generally does not broadcast within the US, or PBS, which is the public broadcast system, which is a non-government, publicly funded, donor-driven broadcast network with radio stations and TV stations. The entire media in the United States is all privately owned. So you have private companies, you have investors, and it's essentially a market-driven economy. It's a market-driven industry. In India, you have Doordarshan and All India Radio, which is government-owned. But as Vanita said, they have all the assets, they have all the resources, but their reach in terms of news is not all that great. You have Lok Sabha TV and Rajya Sabha TV, which are not government-owned. They are owned by the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, which in our system are meant to exist independent of government. And they're not private, obviously. But other than DD or Prasar Bharati and Rajya Sabha TV and Lok Sabha TV, the entire Indian media is privately owned and has been so from before independence, and I dare say has served us reasonably well. So when I talk of the importance of not-for-profit media, this is not meant as a criticism of the idea that for-profit media or private media can be honest, can have integrity, can do good journalism. That's not at all what I'm arguing. That's not at all what the history of Indian journalism tells us. That's not at all what the history of journalism across the world tells us. And if you compare India and the US today, we all know that you have governments in power that have a certain measure of disdain towards the media. President Donald Trump does not hide his contempt for media that is critical of him, in largely the same way as the current establishment in India also has a high degree of disdain and disregard for the media. If Donald Trump talks of crumbling New York Times and fake news, you have ministers here who don't think twice about referring to journalists as prostitutes and who use other kinds of derogatory terms to describe media. And in general, the relationship towards the flow of information and towards transparency it mirrors what you have in the US. But that's where the difference ends. Because if you compare how the privately owned United States media has handled the challenge of reporting a government that is hostile to the press and that in many ways embodies values that run counter to the kind of values which the vast majority of the United States' people embrace, values which in many ways go counter to the American constitutional tradition, such as it is. If you compare the performance of the US press with the Indian press, you can see, as they say in Urdu, Zameen Asman ka farak. In the US, newspapers and television channels are falling over each other to break stories about how dysfunctional the Trump administration is. Hardly a week passes without a new scandal emerging about something the president or his son-in-law or some of his advisors have done, making it to the front page of the Washington Post or New York Times or CBS or NBC or CNN, big channels, big newspapers. The recent scandal where Scaramucci, the communications director of the White House, used all kinds of filthy language against his own colleagues, was widely reported in the American press. And you would be hard-pressed to find examples of that in India, where it seems increasingly the case that for the vast or the large majority of our media, all investigative resources, all the focus of all coverage seems to be aimed at uncovering wrongdoing by the opposition, not by the government. Undoing things that critics of the government may have erred in doing, rather than undoing wrongs, rather than uncovering wrongdoing on the part of those in authority. Now, both India and the US media is privately owned, both of it is for profit. So to argue simply that for-profit media is bad is not a very sustainable argument in this context. Nevertheless, the reason I say that it is important for us to start looking at not-for-profit media is because the business model that has served private Indian media for so long is, to my mind, breaking down, has perhaps already broken down. And this business model, perhaps Vanita described it in some detail, but this business model is largely one where readers and viewers don't pay. It's the advertiser who pays for content. Newspapers are sold at a very, very low price. And the difference between cost of production and sale price is made up by advertising revenue. And when there's a squeeze on advertising revenue, as has happened with the growth of television, with the growth of internet in particular, where a lot of advertising has migrated online, but the yield for individual media houses like ndtv.com or timesofIndia.com is much lower than what they were used to getting in when advertising rupees flowed into print or broadcast. because the lion's share of online advertising revenue gets grabbed by Facebook, Google, and does not come to individual media houses. So there's a crisis of advertising revenue. Many newspapers and TV channels have sought to overcome this crisis by looking at other forms of revenue generation. So you have paid news. People try to squeeze revenue out of news columns, out of editorial coverage, and that leads to all kinds of unethical practices. Many media houses have secondary or tertiary business interests, which are used to cross-subsidize or finance or take care of losses that a media arm of that company is making. And as the years have gone by, all of this has cumulatively put a lot of pressure on the editorial value system of Indian media houses. It's put a lot of pressure on the editorial integrity. It's put a lot of pressure. It's changed the internal structure of media organizations so that today most newspapers don't even have properly functioning editors. Yesterday, when we were trying to, when we did the story on why the article on Amit Shah's assets vanished from the Times of India's website, we called all the editors that we knew. And not a single one of them was willing to give any information or to take responsibility. कि भाई हाँ मैंने कहा इसको उतारने के लिए. So not only do the editors deny any information about this, they also say, यार मेरा नाम मत डालना story में. Don't, even though they've given you no information, they say, यार don't say that you spoke to me either. This is the state of editors and editorial leadership in the bulk of today's big media in India. And this is, I believe, the result of the direction in which the business model has gone. And when me and my colleagues decided to launch The Wire 2 years ago, we were very clear that there is a link between the decreasing independence of the media and its decreasing appetite to speak truth to power, and the business model which drives media. And we said, if we want to create something new, if we are trying to start a website that would do independent journalism, that would do fearless journalism, we somehow need to avoid the pitfalls of being driven by investors, advertisers, because that's the direction which takes you towards knocking on the door of the Amit Shahs and the Arun Jaitlys कि सर हमारा function है उसमें आइए, because उस function में फिर sponsors आएंगे, उससे आपका और revenue आएगा. And there are big papers that give instructions to their journalists in the run-up to major events where they've invited a Narendra Modi or a Arun Jaitley or a Amit Shah, that yeah, for 6 months just go easy on these guys, don't do any stories because then the chap won't come for our event. So we were very clear that this is the lay of the land. Can we think of a new business model, as it were, where we do independent journalism and we raise money and raise resources, not from the traditional investor community, but from civic-minded members of civil society, civic-minded citizens, readers. And we recognize that this was a very difficult proposition because in the online, in the digital world, if I were to ask you to raise your hands, how many of you have downloaded movies free or books free, I'm sure all your hands would go up, so I'm not going to embarrass you. But we live in a world where free downloading is the norm, and paywalls virtually don't exist online. They don't exist even in print. If you can buy Times of India for 3 or 4 rupees, and the price in real terms has not changed, maybe has even decreased over the years, this means there's no paywall for print. So if there's no paywall for print, how do you get online readers to pay for, say, The Wire with a paywall? So we were clear that we are going to start The Wire. We can't knock on the doors of investors. One investor approached us when we were starting The Wire. And he said, I heard you guys are good. You worked in the Hindu before and we want to back you. We believe in what you're doing. And, we will put in money. So we said, fine, let's talk. और फिर बातों में पता चला, this gentleman said कि भाई गुजरात में हमारा तौलिया का फैक्ट्री है, तो मोदी जी के बारे में ज़्यादा मत And I said, this is, if at the very start, somebody who's interested as an investor is going to specify these kinds of conditions, then what's the point? And there are plenty of these kinds of examples where the owner, the malik, the investor tries to call the shots, and we said, we don't want to be a part of that. We were fortunate enough in winning, in starting the Wire at a time when a number of civic-minded entrepreneurs set up something called the Independent and Public-Spirited Media Foundation in Bangalore with a respectable corpus and an independent board of trustees who were dedicated to making grants to new independent media companies such as ourselves. So even though we started the Wire with no outside money other than our own savings, and we appealed to writers, to journalists, to contributors to support what we were trying to do by writing for free, and we did that for a year. Nobody charged us for any of the articles that we ran or the photographs we ran, and it was a great gesture on the part of the media fraternity, all our colleagues, other writers that we had known over the years to support what we were doing. But with our, once we had the support of the Independent Public Spirited Media Foundation, we were able to scale up what we were doing. Now, of course, we regularly raise money from readers. We will start doing this on a more systematic basis, and I am convinced that 2 or 3 years down the road, we would actually be in a position of not only being fully sustainable through the donation of readers and well-wishers, making large number of them making small but regular contributions. So this will not only be sustainable, but it will also allow us to scale up to a level where, in terms of even volume, right now in terms of content, I do believe the Wire gives big media a run for its money, where we are able to provide stories, provide analysis, commentary that you can't find elsewhere, and that big media is forced to take note of, government is forced to take note of. So even though government or people in government or people in authority can ensure that a certain story does not get coverage in any of the TV channels or big media, big newspapers, or that debates don't happen on certain issues. Yogi Adityanath's case is a great example, where you have a sitting chief minister facing charges of involvement in rioting that go back for 7 or 8 years. And his own government then tells the High Court that we aren't going to give sanction to prosecute. And the details of why and how the Uttar Pradesh government was doing this, the completely groundless, by distorting the case record, by distorting the truth of the case, how the Uttar Pradesh government under Adityanath was essentially batting to get Adityanath off the hook. It was a story that no big newspaper or TV channel was willing to have a debate or discussion on. So we got hold of all the papers, we put together a big story, and the story has gone viral in English and Hindi. People are talking about it. It's still not something that the TV channels are going to touch, because I presume they get instructions or they are very responsive to what their owners, and some of these channels are owned by MPs now. So obviously they're not going to do stories that are critical of the current establishment. But we feel that already with our limited resources, as a not-for-profit, we have managed to have enough of an impact on public discourse and on public policy and on what politicians say or do, and that in the years ahead, as we raise more money from readers, again on the basis of not-for-profit. One of the important consequences of being not-for-profit is that this charge that can be made against media, ki tum sab bike hue ho, you're doing this all for your own benefit, that charge doesn't even make it through the front door, because we are saying here, we are being completely upfront. Here is media where the promoters are declaring that there is no profit that they can ever make from it. Again, I'm underlining, I'm not saying profit is a bad thing. Profit drives, has driven Indian media in a good direction for many years. Profit, drives media across the world, and it's not as if private media or for-profit media is bad. That's not the case. But in a situation in India where profits are getting squeezed, and more and more media companies are looking towards unethical practices or are trimming the sails of media independence so as not to alienate the government, because the government has ways. If you look at what's happened to NDTV, for example, where earlier on the issue of how they reported the Pathankot attack, the government tried to shut them down for a day when there was no difference in what NDTV India, the way they covered it compared to other channels. So there are many examples of where you can see pressure being put in one way or the other on media that does not toe the line. So in my view, being not-for-profit at least blocks one avenue where pressure can be put. There may be other avenues. People often ask us, what kind of pressure does the wire face? And so far we've not faced that kind of pressure. But I have no doubt that in the future pressure can come. But being not-for-profit, being dependent on readers and on ensuring that they trust us and that they support us, that is the best way, in my view, of keeping our journalism independent, keeping it fearless, and ensuring that it reports and writes about the kinds of things that readers in this country and citizens of this country, people of this country, in a democracy that is in many ways quite fragile because of the domination of money power, because of the domination of various vested interests. Having a strong, independent, free media is perhaps the best guarantee to make sure that democracy stays on rails. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Yeah.
Hello, sir. My name is Anant. I'm a student of journalism at the University of Delhi. Couple of questions about the wire, sir. I want to know what you think about a subscription-based model vis-a-vis the donation model. Also, if you're looking forward to shifting from a donation-based model to a subscriber-based model for the wire. If not, then why? And the second question, sir, is a quick one. The wire Hindi is doing exceptionally well. So, are you looking forward to diversifying into other languages as well in India?
Yeah, I'll give quick answers. The second one, we will launch, I'm happy to announce and proud to announce, we will be launching the Wire Urdu in the middle of August, where hopefully everything will fall into place on August 15th, if not a few days later. And next in the pipeline is Wire Marathi. So we are very bullish on languages, and we are completely blown away by the response we've got for the Wire Hindi. The engagement, and what's also nice is that if we look at our Facebook page, for example, the Hindi readers are much more civil than the English ones. There's much less trolling, there's much less abusiveness. People are willing to engage on the basis of ideas, which I find refreshing and good. That's as far as the language goes. On the issue of subscription or donation, see, subscription in a technical sense would mean you then have a way to block your product from non-subscribers. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to have a paywall. If at all we go down that direction, we may do something like what EPW does, which is that the archived content is paywalled. But that's very difficult to implement. And because we share a lot of our, we have, there are smaller publications that use our stories. And it wouldn't make sense for a story to be blocked, for somebody to not have access to a story on our site, but then be able to read it on Business Standard or somewhere else. So I'm not in favor of subscription defined as a model where you have a paywall.
So what about the News Laundry subscription model?
You see, News Laundry subscription model again depends on blocking some content from some people who don't pay XYZ amount, right? So, I can think of a donation model or a membership model where membership would give a reader access to content plus. Right? So there may be events, there may be frequent interaction with editors. Let's say if you're a member of the Wire, through a donation that you make every year, you may be able to take part in an event that we may organize in your city twice a year, where you can discuss all the issues, or we may try to bring a speaker. Let's say we have 800 members in Patna, then we would try to endeavor to have, say, 2 or 3 events in Patna, where we bring a high-profile speaker to Patna for interaction. So we're looking at all of these things as ways of having engagement with readers, but not by a paywall.
Thank you.